What did you come away most surprised by from this conversation, given how many you've had with him previously?
I think he's very reflective of how things have gone. And that's one of the things I like about him. Yeah, there are some politicians, we all know who we're talking about, who go, I'm absolutely right about everything. I've got my big vision. I know the answer to every problem. Here it is. And Keir Starmer's not like that. He is very iterative. If things don't go well, he goes, well, why didn't that work? Is there something else we can do? And he'll try different things until he finds something that works. And that's not kind of what journalists always want. It's not what the whole political industry want. They always want the next new, big, idea, but might actually be the best way to get solutions. If you think of how he's operating internationally, you don't go storming into the White House and go, here's my vision for peace. Because how do we make this really difficult situation a bit better? Well, I think you need to apply that to the domestic front too, because it is really difficult. There isn't a lot of money around. Public services are failing. The public itself is cynical. Public finances are rubbish. And in that situation, you want someone who's just going to try and work out how to make this a bit better and get some progress rather than pretend they can solve everything all at once.
It would have been a slightly different piece if you were publishing it this Sunday, given the events of yesterday.
It was messy. It was really, really messy. And there's no...
You're surprised by it?
I thought the concessions they made the previous week would be enough. I think quite clearly, there's an accumulation of small slights. I think that a lot of MPs feel completely detached from Downing Street and very remote from decisions. And I think this was more than just about more than just the bill. It was right. It was people sort of expressing sort of anger about quite a lot of what's happened over the last year and how they feel have been treated. But I don't think, I'm the eternal optimist, but Pat McFadden was out this morning talking about, both he and I were old enough to remember 97 when it's a very similar rebellion, 47 MPs voting against Tony Blair on welfare reform, more than 100 abstained of ministerial resignations. I was a journalist at the time and I was doing the hyperbolic coverage, is Blair finished, is this, and of course he wasn't. And that Labour government went on to take 500,000 children out of poverty, millions back to work, and provide hope to the poorest in the country. And I think, sometimes these moments remind Labour governments about what they're about and what they're elected to do, rather than posturing strength and fetishising toughness.
Well, not just Labour governments. We were reflecting upon Henry Campbell Bannerman in 1906.
Oh, you are.
and the similar experiences also.
How often do we start a conversation?
We speak of little else on this programme, Tom. We speak of little else, but they won a landslide victory against a Conservative Party best described as bewildered, and then didn't come out of the blocks firing on all cylinders. But we've got several things, including free school dinners, appropriately enough, as a consequence of the agenda they put together subsequently. So what I haven't picked up on from you as a staunch supporter of Keir Starmer and an old pal, or from Keir Starmer's public appearances, is any sense at all of panic?
Look, he's got quite large reserves of resilience, I think. I think he doesn't always show his emotion. I think when he was growing up, he learnt to suppress his emotion, but I think he's got quite a lot there. I think he's got quite deep values. And I think one of the frustration that a lot of people, including some of his advisors, have about him is that he doesn't connect what he's doing in politics to those values. They're not like an ideology. They're just very recognisable British values. But his mum was disabled when he was growing up. He grew up, a large part of his childhood was dominated by his mother's pain. His brother was disabled. A large part of his adult life has been dominated by that narrative, I think, about the siblings he left behind. But he doesn't talk about that when he talks about disability benefit reforms. It just sounds like a sort of number crunching thing. So how can you bring that actually quite cauldron of emotion that I think is inside Keir Starmer a bit more out, so people can actually see the values, which I think that's the way to... at the moment there's lots of really good policy the government's doing, lots of good things the government are doing, long-term measures for investment in infrastructure and training, all these things. But we can't join the dots up, or those bullet points up into a picture without some values to connect them, I think.
And is no one on the payroll telling him this?
I'm sure people on the payroll telling him, because he's got lots of people on his payroll.
The right people there.
Oh, look, James, I have been an advisor.
I know. And a journalist.
And a journalist and other things. And regrets about it. Look, I know how hard it is on the pitch when you're sliding around in the mud. And I know how annoying it is when someone's sitting up in the stand saying, you should be doing that. So I don't criticise advisors if at all possible, because I know how tough a job it is. And I think it's a particularly tough job with Keir in a way, because he doesn't sort of come in and lay out his values on a plate for you then to sort of cut and paste into a speech. It's more complicated, but politics and life are actually complicated. The solutions and the problems for our country are complicated, and we've got a complicated Prime Minister. I wish that complexity and nuance could be seen a bit more, because I think that actually looks like Britain rather than these simple, straight-lined big ideas.
And that provides a little bit of context to what was, for me at least, by far the most moving vignette in your recent piece, The Private Trials of Keir Starmer, for the Observer, which involves the passing of the younger brother you've just referred to, Nick, who died on Boxing Day, and Starmer's decision to, I think the day after that he'd been taking calls, in his own words, on the future of European security, to go to Leeds and personally clean out the flat. How did that come about? Did he volunteer that information to you? Did you ask for it? Is this part of a conscious decision to try to show some of the stuff that you've said he should be showing? Just talk me through that process.
Because I knew about Nick. I knew that Nick had cancer when I was writing the book, and Keir Starmer asked me to keep that out because he didn't want to disrespect him. He didn't want to play that in. Now, that's an act of integrity and authenticity, which people don't see. They just think, well, he doesn't know anything about real life. In fact, he's got this big bit of real life and he's not telling about it. And there were lots of other things about Nick too, including the fact he'd had a more or less nomadic existence for a few years, and then finally, when Keir's parents died, got some money to buy this house in Leeds, and he finally settled down at the house, and then he found out he got terminal cancer. And Keir was going to see him secretly over and over again, never wanted the cameras there. Didn't want to use his brother as a prop. And I think you contrast it with some other politicians he's not the only politician who's had family tragedy, but they played that out in public. There'd be daily, weekly updates in the Daily Mail or something about tragic this or tragic that. And that's their choice. But Keir doesn't do that. And he told me about going up to see his brother's flat after he died, when it happened. And again, I didn't write about it then. I asked about it when I saw him just recently. I said, look, can I put that on the record? And he sort of, yeah, all right. It's been a bit of a time. But it's not being used as a PR exercise.
So you prized it out of him?
I prized it out of him over 3 years of talking to him. And, the actual episode is quite extraordinary.
It is.
I mean, he's on his hands and knees, scrubbing the back of a toilet, going around the flat with back bin liners, leaving his security outside to pick up his dirty clothes on the floor and put them in a bag. And then he sort of almost starts crying. He's saying he's putting what's left of his brother's life in a black bin bag. And it's very emotional, and it's real in a way that I think a lot of politicians actually aren't real when they're off camera.
And you don't say, but it occurred to me that part of his motivation, because he wanted to protect his brother, I didn't want to let him down, he said. I didn't want anyone else there. It was because, in his own words, he hadn't kept the place very clean, and he would have had no control over who might have taken photographs even.
I think that's it.
And we live in a world, sadly, where we could both name 10 men who would print them in a heartbeat.
But he's always been very protective of Nick. I mean, Nick had difficulties learning when he was growing up. He was teased at school. And a young Keir would get into fights if he heard Nick being called names.
We took a call last year from someone who'd been at school with him.
Been in a fight.
And said, I don't really remember him from school, but I remember gathering around a fight, and he said, and I'm not a fan of him politically, but goodness me, I wouldn't want to be punched by him. He was really laying into someone. And it occurred to me reading this article that someone had probably insulted his brother.
I think that was also, I mean, you still don't say the words thick or stupid in the Prime Minister's presence. Right. You don't, because he's heard those names too often directed at his brother. So I think, but the difference is between that youthful Keir Starmer, who everyone said was a bit of a sort of rebel without a cause, is he learnt to control himself and button himself
Possibly too
up.
much.
Possibly, although if you're sitting in the Oval Office being goaded by J.D. Vance, it's not a bad idea to be able to express your emotions.
You certainly shouldn't be punching him.
Yeah.
Final question, and I'll read back a bit of the piece. For someone who claims he doesn't do self-analysis, that's pretty insightful. And in the end, this sharp division between his public role and private self is not only about protecting his family. I suspect the tension in him is also the source of the relentless, often ruthless drive and determination that most people do not see. What is that tension? Just talk us through what that tension is.
It's the tension between the public and the private. It's the tension with, why he wants to protect his brother, why he gets really angry when his wife is dragged into the row about free clothes, why he
it's quite old-fashioned. He almost lives in a world where you can't keep those separate, and yet he's determined to do so.
When they set fire to his old house,
yes,
the front door, that front door had huge symbolic import to him. He used to talk about it. I go through that door, it's real life again, I'm just dad. I can put politics behind me. He wouldn't let people from politics inside that front door. And they set fire to the door. Can you imagine what that does? I mean, it's, that's the sort of portal point between his real life and his new life in politics. So he does get really, when you see that intensity, is when you see that tension between the public and the private. But I personally think he actually needs that tension. You can't just, if he just sort of slopped it all out, he wouldn't be the person he is. What's driven him on? What's driven him from a sort of pretty rough working class background, through university, through the upper echelons of law, through politics like a hot knife through butter, frankly, is that tension. That tension is dynamic, and people see this rather sort of bland public figure behind the glasses, but there is a huge amount of relentlessness and resilience and determination in that man, which comes from that tension, I think, that drive. He said when he was doing the immigration press conference after his house being firebombed, and I could see something was up with him. He was doing this thing of shutting his eyes and said, we just have to get through this.
Yeah.
And he told me later he was thinking about his mum, who was always in pain. Getting dressed was painful, and she got on and did it. Now that, I think, is what he needs to draw on now, because this is a really tough time.
Yes.
It's a really painful time for everyone associated with this government, but you've got to get on and move on and do it.
And the other big scoop in the piece, of course, was his regret over using that phrase, island of strangers.
Yeah, and I think he really wanted that to be in the piece. I double-checked with him.
Yeah.
Because it's the exception to the rule.
Why didn't he come out sooner and say so? Why didn't I? Because, I mean, it's a good piece, and it's received traction as you'd expect, but you'd have thought he could have done that the day after. He could have put his hands up and said, I had no idea that I was unintentionally echoing Enoch Blooming Powell. Obviously, that was not my intention. He let it lie.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact events, but it seemed that a lot of people are out sort of saying they're going to stand by every word quite quickly.
Yes.
And he's always, I don't think he'd had time to step back and do a sort of reflective conversation. I mean, every 15 minutes of his day is blocked out. So I don't know the answer to that. I think he probably should have come out and said it earlier, but I'm glad he said it now. I think it's an important thing to say. If it's not him, if he didn't believe in those words, and there are lots of mitigating circumstances why he hadn't read through them properly, then he should say, it's not me, rather than have them hung around his neck forever.
And he explains in the piece, which is available online, what exactly he was trying to convey when he found himself using that unfortunate phraseology. The very imaginatively titled Keir Starmer, the biography, is out in paperback at the end of the...
It does what it says on the tin.
It does do what it says on the tin. Tom Baldwin is the author of said biography. End of this month, the end of June?
No,
end of July.
End of July, but you can pre-order it now, and quite a lot of people are doing so after that Observer piece of things.
Many thanks. Always good to catch up.
Thank you.